Welcome and good evening, everyone. Some of you who are crowded in the back should know that there is a balcony upstairs, so please find your way and have a seat. It's wonderful to see you all here at Union in June, when our school is not even in session, but we continue to come together to have very important discussions. And it's especially welcome to know that we have a lot of people who are tuning in through our live stream. I'm Serene Jones. I'm the president here at Union, and I'm the Johnson Family Professor of Religion and Democracy, which is a central theme that runs through all of the work that Union does day in and day out in our classrooms and in our public programming. And I'm thrilled to be opening tonight's conversation, which sits at the heart of that discussion, and that is a conversation on fossil fuel development in the time of climate change, an interfaith perspective hosted by Union's Center for Earth Ethics. And I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists who have come here this evening to be a part of this discussion. We're very proud at Union to be the home for Union's Center for Earth Ethics. This conversation this evening, for those of you who have not been here since Monday, is part of a larger conversation that is taking place in our second annual Ministry in the Time of Climate Change training for multi-faith ministers and leaders to give them a theoretical and practical multi-faith perspective on how, as religious leaders and spiritual leaders in their community, they can best address this pressing moral issue, in fact, the most pressing moral issue of our day. So for 2 days, they've been having vigorous conversations, and all of you who have been a part of that, could you just raise your hand so we'll know who you are? It's a wonderful group of 40 religious leaders. So just a word about the Center for Earth Ethics as we get started. The Center for Earth Ethics, in its mission statement, says it is a place where value is assessed in terms of its ability to sustain all of humankind and sustain our Earth. And those two measures of how we think about value and the character of what we do in our day-to-day lives sits at the heart of what this center has done now for 3 years. It's wonderful to have with us here Corinna Gore, who is the founder and director of the center since 2015. There's lots to say about Corinna. She has a BA from Harvard. She has a law degree from Columbia. She's been a lawyer. She's been a journalist. She's helped run a campaign. She's worked in the nonprofit sector. She has taught here at Union. She was, I am very proud to say, a student here at Union. And this evening's event and the center out of which it flows is, in fact, the brainchild. I really should say it is the heart child. Actually, it's best to say it is the total being child of Corinna Gore, who has built this conversation at Union in a way that's unique, in that it puts questions of moral value and spirituality at the center of the conversation about climate crisis. And it does so in such a way that it's not a top-down understanding of where the change will come from, but a grassroots, from the bottom-up understanding. And that is who Corinna in her very heart and being is. And it's a reflection of those deep commitments that we're very privileged to have here at Union. I'm also very happy to introduce another Union graduate, and that is Derrick Harkins, who is Senior Vice President for Innovation in Public Programmings, who is responsible for a growing array of public on-campus programmings that we're offering here at Union. This is one among those. We have programs called the Union Forum, the Millennial Leadership Project, an Encore project for people who are coming back after retirement to reconsider how they can give back. We have a Cairo Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice, and the list goes on. And at the center of all of those conversations is Derrick, who has played a leading role in pulling together our conversations for this evening. So, Corinna and Derrick, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Serena, and again, welcome to all of you this evening. It is truly our pleasure to be able to be part of this conversation, this most urgent conversation, and the work that has been going on by way of the Center for Earth Ethics, as Serena has noted, has been long in the making, beyond even just the present realities of today's most recent headlines. And because of that, we're committed as well to not only addressing the urgencies that we see around us, but reminding you and all of us that the work that we're committed to will continue going forth in the same measure of robustness as it has even in these preceding years. I want to personally thank Corinna again for the leadership that she has given to the Center for Earth Ethics, gathering this conference again in its second year, and all of those who are here from around the country, who have been a part of truly vital ongoing workshops and sessions throughout the course of yesterday and today and going into tomorrow. This evening is a part of that, and we are truly indebted to not only all of those participants and all of you, but those who are part of our panel. And so in order to allow you to know who our panelists are and a little bit more about the work of the Center for Earth Ethics, it's my pleasure to introduce Corinna Gore.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. I would like to thank Union, President Serene Jones, Vice President Derrick Harkins, also our Executive Vice President Fred Davey. You all here have made this a place where many people can flourish and find their voice. I am among the graduates of Union who've been able to do that. And everything that you said so graciously about how I created and run the center is entirely because of my Union education. I had it was also because of some things I learned at home. But I did have a transformative educational experience at Union. I highly recommend it. Everyone should apply and recommend that people apply to be students here, because what is taught here is very, very deep and also very, very practical in terms of what we're facing in the world today. And I'm really filled with joy to be able to be a member of this community. So thank you very much. Also, under the leadership of the three people I mentioned and the board here at Union, Union was the first seminary in the nation to divest from fossil fuels. We had a conference here called Religions for the Earth right before the People's Climate March, with nearly 300 religious and spiritual leaders from around the world here, right here in this chapel, talking about the moral dimensions of the climate crisis and how we might draw from faith and wisdom traditions to meet this challenge. Union has also been in the forefront of so many issues with racial justice, with gender issues, with many aspects of economic inequity and injustice, and really has a gift in this place to see how they connect and how we need to look at the root causes of what we're facing in order to really solve the problems. So I'm just very happy to be here, and I would like to just very briefly introduce our panel. We're really happy that we're able to join a couple of conversations here, and I'm hoping that Aza Karam and Bert Vysotsky will both speak a little bit about the intensive work they've been doing in the past couple of days regarding religion and development issues. So the first two on our panel are Aza Karam, who serves as the Senior Advisor on Culture at the United Nations Population Fund and is chair of the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. Rabbi Bert Vysotsky serves as Appleman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue at Jewish Theological Seminary. We're also very proud he is a member of the Board of Advisors of the Center for Earth Ethics, and we really rely on him for his support and guidance. Pat Williams is the James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and a columnist for The Nation. Al Gore served for 8 years in the House of Representatives and 8 years in the Senate representing the state of Tennessee. He served as vice president for 8 years. His passion is really in protecting our earth and communicating to others about that. And for that, he's been recognized widely. He continues to find new mediums. He has a new movie coming out called An Inconvenient Sequel, which I hope everyone will go see. And he is the chairman of the Climate Reality Project. So with that, let's turn it over to our panelists.
Thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I know that I'm delaying every minute I speak. I delay from who you really are here to listen to, so I'm just going to say something very brief and short. Thanks very much to the leadership of Union Theological Seminary for this wonderful opportunity to be here with you today and to have this conversation in the first place. My first introduction to Union Theological Seminary was on the occasion of coming to receive, on behalf of my then boss, Dr. Thuraya Obaid, a Saudi Arabian woman who was an Undersecretary General at the United Nations, and one of the first voices in the UN system to start to say that we cannot do anything in terms of international and sustainable human development without looking at the role that religion and spirituality plays in everyday life, but also in the decision-making that the top policy officials make. Union Theological Seminary was kind enough to grant her an award, and I had the opportunity to come then and receive it on her behalf because she wasn't there. And that was my first exposure into this amazing institution, which is always a tremendous honor to come back to and to learn. I learn plenty when I come here. I want to say deep thanks to Corinna and to the Center for Earth Justice because they've been able to open my mind to another dimension of that passion and faith that Serene spoke to about the work that Corinna does. And it is thanks to her I know that I happen to land here. But I also want to say that the last 2 weeks have been intensive preparation for a 2-day phenomenal event that just took place, which thanks to Union Theological Seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary, and largely Rabbi Bert Vysotsky from the Milstein Center, and the United Nations, a number of different UN entities, and our World Bank colleagues, together with a whole bunch of faith-based organizations who, between them, provide anywhere between 30 to 60% of basic social services to the world's peoples in many parts of the world. For the first time ever, we came together and hosted a 2-day strategic learning exchange where the whole principle was that we would have the opportunity to learn from one another why religion matters, how it matters, to the realization of the entire Sustainable Development Goals agenda, of which, as you know, environment and climate change occupy significant portions. It was an incredibly important meeting for us to be able, it was a meeting of hearts and minds. We learned a great deal from one another, at least I hope we did. Some of my colleagues are here in the room who were partaking of the learning. Do not dare say anything against what I'm just about to say. It was a great moment and we enjoyed it tremendously. Having said that, one of the most important learnings I took from this opportunity, and every time we host this for 7 years running, I continue to learn and to be humbled by what I learned from the participants in this particular endeavor. I learned that we still have a long way to go in terms of really appreciating why it is that religion and faith can be at the heart of what changes hearts and minds. When we talk about the environment and climate change, one of the tipping points is precisely that, being able to change attitudes and behaviors. And the strongest way to change attitudes and behaviors is to tackle the issue of how people believe, how they think, and therefore how they behave. And there's no way we can do that anywhere in the world, without understanding or appreciating the role and the value of religion in people's lives. Understood differently, to include the spiritual aspect and to include indigenous peoples and their very legitimate and important rights that are the tipping point, quintessentially, in the engagement with environmental issues. I've also learned, quite frankly, that one of the things that we continue to talk about is why it is that hearts and minds don't change in spite of very obvious realities. We still have a denial of some very real things that we see every day. A stage of denial that our environment is changing. Yet the spokespersons of truth and those who will stand witness to truth over the centuries are often people of faith. And it is therefore important upon us and incumbent upon us when we work in policy institutions to be able to listen to the wisdom of the various people of faith. It does occasionally take a very critical policymaker to alert all of us to some very real challenges and realities. And it is therefore the third lesson that I continue to learn is no one voice, no matter how powerful it is, can speak loudly enough. That it is the cacophony of voices and the multiplicity of hands that ultimately enables us to make the changes that we need. And it is therefore important that we stand side to side, not only as people of faith, but as people of no faith, and as people who are both settlers as well as indigenous, the people who come from the south, from the north, from the east, from the west, and that is when we take that stand together that we can actually effect the change that we want to see accomplished. Unfortunately, we hear a lot of silos, we see a lot of silos in our engagement, but that is at the cusp of changing. One of the conversations that has changed the course of those of us in the UN system who are committed to international sustainable development and to the welfare and well-being of humankind, one of the first conversations that started was around environment and religion. And it started way back in the 70s and went to the 80s and suddenly came to a halt. I do not know why. But I do know that when the HIV and AIDS virus struck forcefully, the conversation between the secular and the religious was opened again. And this was in the middle of the 1980s. And with the opening of that conversation came the opening of some very, very tough, big, heavy, secular doors, again, to the realm of religion, faith, and spirituality. And today we're seeing a resurgence of the relevance of the religious voice across the table. The two areas in which this voice is loudest in the policy-making world, three areas in which the voice of the faith communities is loudest in the policy-making areas are in the area of environment, in the area of health, and in the area of children and children's rights, in as much as that covers and cross-cuts many areas. But today the conversation is no longer about religion alone, it is about religion, values, and human rights. And I think that's the direction that we need to do, because the tipping point is to be able to say we don't have several discourses, but we have one discourse that combines and transcends the divides between all, because it is quintessentially about sustainable human development. Thank you.
It's never fun following Aza. Not only is she always great, but in 5 minutes she can give a 12-minute talk. So I want to say thank you to Union Seminary. I was a student at Union Seminary in the 70s when I first learned Greek, and then learning New Testament Greek, learned New Testament. I've been a very proud adjunct faculty member at Union since 1980. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize my teachers and heroes who are sitting in the front row, Don and Peggy Schreiber. I want to basically speak briefly. I'm going to have 2 verses from the Hebrew Bible and 3 quotes from the movie Casablanca. So let me start with the Hebrew Bible. We are taught in Psalms, L'Adonai ha'aretz umloah tevel v'yoshveh. The earth is the Lord's and everything that is in it. And that is something that we can never, ever lose sight of. As religious actors, we must understand that this is not our land, this is not our water, this is God's earth, and we have been put upon it by God's grace. Which leads me, of course, to the second verse in the book of Genesis. We are put upon the earth, le'ovda u'leshomra. We have been put on this earth to serve it and to preserve it. And we are failing. We are sinning when we watch the earth quite literally go to hell. And this is a real difficult problem. So now let me turn from the Hebrew Bible to that other canonical text, the movie Casablanca. I start with that opening line, I came here for the waters. Indeed, Corinna and I have been working together with a group of theologians and attorneys from Fordham University and from really around the metropolitan New York area, studying together the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si. And in studying the encyclical, we decided that we wanted to not only learn, but to do. We were meant to be encouraged to do something to help preserve the earth that we live on. And we decided we would look to water, because water is the source of our life, and without water, we will simply perish. One of the things Corinna and I don't know, is Mindahi here?
He's not, his wife Geraldine.
Geraldine is here, thank you. And a Muslim colleague, Hussein Rashid, the four of us put together a water liturgy. And tomorrow morning, with the group that's here for Corinna's Center for Earth Ethics, we will share some of that water liturgy. The point of the liturgy is not only to express our gratitude to God for water, but to reflect on water and how we use and abuse water in our daily round. So we've created liturgies for every moment of the day that we come in contact with water to sensitize us, to help us remember, and to make us preserve, once again, our earth. My second quote is one you can probably predict. We'll always have Paris. I want to say for the record that Corinna has been planning this conference and this evening long before the president got up and withdrew from the Paris Accords. And I know that Corinna was deeply concerned actually with the Accords themselves when they came into being. Did you not go to France for that? Yes, she did. Whether or not we're in or out of that voluntary system, we will always have Paris. Whether it's on a city level, whether it's on a state level, whether it's individual actors, we will act to preserve the earth, to bring down the carbon footprint, and that's why I come now to my third quote, which is directed specifically at Vice President Gore. Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We have looked to you, Mr. Gore, for a long time, and your passion for the earth is something that has never escaped us. But we look to you now more than ever for leadership. We are counting on you. Like you, I have a grandchild. I have a grandson, Asher. And I want this to be a place where he can breathe, where he can splash in the water, where he can grow strong and hardy. I want this to be a country that continues to be a leader in the environmental movement and not a laggard. And so we're hoping, not just you, we can't put it all on your shoulders, but we are here, arrayed as an army you can deploy, because we are ready to work to preserve the earth. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a tremendous pleasure to share this stage with such distinguished speakers. Vice President Gore, to whom I am so indebted for inspiring much of the work that I have tried to do. I am grateful for the invitation from UTS, from Serene, and my friends, the Shrivers, who have been so generous in some of my work on bioethics. I also want to say on behalf of the law school how proud we are of Corinna Gore as a graduate. I know the celebration of her as a graduate of UTS, but we want to claim her as well. And her institute has not just sprung, I think, from a legal ground framework, but also she has taught those of us in the law school much about how to translate religious and spiritual concerns into legal claims. About how to make political appeals expressible within the language of the law. And that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to fly lickety-split through a PowerPoint, which, if you don't catch all of it, I will make it available for your curriculum. But I was actually in Paris during the last week, which was a very interesting experience. So this is Pittsburgh from Paris. And Donald Trump's speech, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, was distinguished by its market language. It was completely monetized or beholden to exchange value, that is, everything could be translated into money. He used words like financial, economic burdens, wages, cost, factories, industry, trade, taxes, and wealth. And he put it in a framework of competitiveness against other economies and nations to the point of silliness. If they can do clean coal, then we should be able to as well. Other countries are gaining wealth at our country's expense. We don't want other leaders in countries laughing at us anymore. This was filled with false comparatives and questionable hierarchies. Not only factually false that we are the cleanest environmentally friendly country on earth, but also it completely evades the question of whether it's clean enough for survival itself. It was language that was narrowly exclusive, go it alone, either or view of American interests in the face of an impending and shared global disaster. Pittsburgh, not Paris, the uniqueness of America's constitution and sovereignty as though that will keep our boat afloat. Now, these comparative frames raise the question of how to save a planet and how to save ourselves when we are inflected by the interconnected, intersectional parrying among different languages. Because literally it was like Donald Trump was speaking a different language than I understand to be the disaster we are facing. And one of the discourses, one of the languages he was speaking was that of market valuation, bounded, disconnected from environment, a temporal frame that tends to be short-term, mobile, fluid kinds of truth. Another discourse or language he was speaking was that of law, which has a sort of invested interest in the stability of institutions, a reliability of outcome, no double jeopardy, certainty in transactions. But this creates a mythos of continuity, even when not materially grounded, that actually we may die. Scientific convention is another kind of language at stake, which is not only about established truth as we sometimes think of it, as written in stone, but also a willingness to be surprised and acceptance of the uncertain, the unfamiliar, unimagined possibility, awareness of unintended consequence, and a constant testing for reproducible results. And this tends toward complexity and the evolutionary as a temporal stance, which we have great difficulty in terms of institutional structures that are political and legal. So the question, how do we frame or craft frames of reference that enlarge our sense of shared destiny in the face of, again, this looming collective disaster? Is there a gesturing toward different configuration of human embodiment or of the biospheres in which we exist that we can find buried in the figurations provided by different discourses? It seems to me Donald Trump speaks the language of homo economicus, or me first, doing business is America first. He's speaking a language that's even narrower than that of corporate personhood or a corpus that involves many. It is a different discourse than that of the citizen subject. It is a different discourse than that of we the people as an aspirational collective. And it certainly is a different discourse of the brother rabbit, sister water, mother earth, and father sky. And it is reflected, I think, in the different languages of law itself, which, you know, in law we sometimes recognize that there's an individual self whose actions, when they affect no one else, we just don't care about. That's the ultimate libertarian free agent. In contract, we start exchanging with somebody else, and we become a customer, a consumer, and we assume a kind of obligation in mutual exchange and expectation, but the government should be out of it. We don't want regulation. And I'll skip through the sort of expanding moral universes of law to constitutional law, which is the largest in our American system of law, which is that of citizenship, constitutive relationship, public good, self in relation to a larger polity, and structures of authority in law. But what we do not have in American law, generally, is a claim for human rights. In fact, one of our Supreme Court justices has described those as foreign law, international and human rights, or a value in dignitarian interests and integrity of the body. And then even beyond that, in the largest moral framework would be ecological concerns or non-human-centered ontologies, such as those embedded in Laudato Si, the value of environmental and planetary concerns. And we don't have a language for that in law, so how are we going to translate that into, and I think that that's into the language of law, into claims that are structural, and that's the problem we're facing. This is, if you can imagine, each of these interests is in a sort of expanding set of concentric circles with the personal or the self at the center. We don't want to regulate that, but expanding levels of what we might want to regulate, going from the social relational to the ultimate public interest, and even beyond that in perhaps the larger global sense, the planetary interest. I sometimes use this picture in my classes, and in a game I call caption, or fill in the caption. And this is actually in the wake of the Haitian earthquake. And the students who simply see the picture frequently see supplication, survival, a kind of prayer for succor. This was actually a picture I took from a newspaper, and the title was Looters, which reverses, it's a discourse that completely reverses the language of collective need into a voice of that bottle of water being thrown to them. So it is literally the bottle speaks, help, help, I am being undone in the system of property. So the language of property is the language of you are a looter when you make claim on this. Now you can imagine that bottle of water as the coal industry and those arms and the rest of us as humanity in the figuration that Donald Trump set up for us. This is a set of contrasted discourses, in other words. In contract, or neoliberal, the narrowest moral language in law, obligations are only voluntarily undertaken, willfully calculated exchange value. It works best with fungible, inanimate objects, and it commodifies the thing being transferred. As opposed to constitution, which is relational and has imposed obligations of restraint, and pricelessness of our bodies, of humanity, but also of the entire web of life. I'll give you two quick examples before I leave you. One is Gene Kranich and the pay-to-spray system that you might remember was in the news about several years ago. An elderly wheelchair-bound man forgot to pay the annual fee of $75 to buy into the services of the county's fire department services. His house caught on fire, the fire department came and watched it burn to the ground, killing his pets and destroying his field and all other possessions. He offered to pay the actual cost of putting it out, but the fire chief operated according to the logic of Kranich being a free rider, that to do so would incentivize others to make bad economic choices and not to pay. And the fire department hosed down the houses and fields of neighbors who had paid the $75. Now, there are two ways to understand this, two discourses in law of recognizing this. One is the market. The fire was configured in a discourse of market as bounded or boundable, a consequence that could be contained to the decision-making rationalities of a single actor. And payment is the central moral value. He didn't pay the $75, he has to suffer the consequences. Another is the constitutional or the broader moral universe in which fire is a shared threat, a public harm whose potential for ignoring human boundaries poses risks. And so we pool our resources for the collective good. Public health and safety becomes the central moral value. One can translate this into a quest for anything from public health insurance to a public ethic around the environment. I'll skip over that. A second example is John Wood. There's a wonderful film called Finders Keepers I recommend highly. John Wood had his leg amputated after a plane crash. He had it embalmed because he wanted it to be buried with his entire body. He kept it stored in a Weber grill, which he put in a storage locker for whose fees he failed to pay. And the contents of the locker were sold at auction, and a man named Shannon Wisnett purchased the grill and leg, decided to use the leg in a Halloween display for which viewing he charged an entry fee for the ghoulishness of it. Again, in a market discourse, a lawyer would say, Shannon Wisnett is a good faith purchaser for value in contract who can treat the leg as a commodity with pecuniary value fixed by Wisnett's choice, his will, his privatized determination. In a constitutional or a larger, more expansive moral universe, the leg is more like a relic, a religious relic, a conceptual extension of John Wood's body, and therefore beyond price or priceless because it is holistically implicated in dignitarian concerns or the respectful, non-commodified regard we owe one another as citizens, as humans, but also as living beings. And so, for me, this is all about a conceptual conundrum, a problem of putting life or animated, vivified, communally generative, constitutional or dignitary problems into the narrower, de-animating, fungibility-centered, efficiently disconnected moral and jurisprudential frame of contract, as opposed to, and conversely, giving inanimate, fungible things life by taking them out of the realm of contract and giving them constitutional protection, like corporations or proprietary claims or patents over our DNA and so forth. And so I think that we ultimately have to consider this system of signification, how it might be tracked as a symbolic or epistemic matter, as knowledge production, as a very directive lens of the language through which we learn to speak. So consider how Flint's water, for example, was treated like Gene Kranich's fire. or how Henrietta Lacks' cells were mined and monetized like the Halloween display of Wood's embalmed leg, or how coal production is understood only in terms of wealth production rather than disease production, or how drought and flood and species extinction and food chain collapse is framed less as a hole in the planetary boat on which we are all sinking, but framed as though it were a winnable war over limited resources whose zero-sum economic wars we can cure asthma and resolve food chain collapse. It is framed as though some can win while others lose. But wealth is not what is at stake in this battle, whether it's Trump Inc.'s or Pittsburgh's or Paris's or China's, but rather the very fragile, resonantly interconnected systems of sustenance upon which all life is dependent and interdependent. And I will again make this available. Sorry for racing through this.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It really is such an honor to be here, and I want to begin by acknowledging Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, the president of Union Theological Seminary, and saying what everyone who has followed her leadership here recognizes. She has lifted this storied, legendary institution to new heights, and it is an honor to be here. And Dr. Jones, to Derrick Harkins, the senior VP, and my friend Fred Davey, executive VP, to the luminous director of the Center for Earth Ethics, my daughter Corinna, from whom I have learned an amazing amount, and that's not a throwaway line. And by the way, I've learned an amazing amount over these last 2 days from those who have gathered at the Center for Earth Ethics for this session that we've been having. It's really been an amazing experience for me. And it is and let me acknowledge Doug Glancy from the Climate Reality Project, the Speakers Network, and Jill Linus, who have helped to organize this from the standpoint of the Climate Reality Project, and acknowledge all of the great staff of the Center for Earth Ethics who have supported Corinna in this project. It is a great honor to be on the same panel and dais with Azza Karam and Bert Visovsky and Pat Williams. I look forward to the interchange and to the opportunity to respond to your questions. The topic here connects development and economic development, fossil fuels, and climate change. And I want to briefly touch on each of those three concepts. First of all, where the climate crisis is concerned, there are only three questions remaining to be addressed. Must we change? Can we change? Will we change? In answer to the first question, must we change? The answer is yes, spoiler alert. But the answer comes now not only from the virtually unanimous scientific community around the world, but also from a new participant in the discussion, Mother Nature. We are seeing the consequences of the climate crisis already. In this city, where Superstorm Sandy crossed waters of the Atlantic Ocean on the way to New York City that were 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal. That is why it was so much more powerful and so much more destructive than hurricanes had been in the past. And because sea level has risen, it was more destructive still. We are putting 110 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the atmosphere every 24 hours. That's a lot, and it is added each day to the accumulated total, which is now trapping as much extra heat energy in the Earth system as would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day. It's a big planet, but that is an enormous amount of energy. It's raising temperatures. Each year now is a record year. 16 of the 17 hottest have been since 2001. And most of the heat energy is going into the oceans, thus the stronger hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons. And the water cycle is being disrupted. I look forward to the water liturgy tomorrow morning. There's been much discussion at this meeting about the wisdom from indigenous leaders and traditions that water is life, and the Standing Rock Sioux taught the entire world an important message with their famous teaching, Water is Life. I learned a new twist, Serene, on the Golden Rule in the meetings this morning, where one of our participants from an indigenous tradition said, "Do unto those downstream what you would have those upstream from you do to you." And it is an interesting and important way to think of it. In addition to heat waves and the disruption of the water cycle leading to bigger downpours and floods and mudslides, we have the deeper droughts, and we have tropical diseases moving toward the poles, bringing unfamiliar diseases into latitudes that they have never entered previously. The Zika virus caused such disruption and tragedy last year. I heard doctors in parts of Central and South America say something I've never heard in my life. They said to women, "Don't get pregnant for 2 years until we find a way to control this crisis." When we hear a message like that, should that not set off alarm bells for the human race? We see also, I personally witnessed fish from the ocean swimming in the streets of Miami Beach on a sunny day. Last week, the same thing happened in Honolulu, because the sea level is rising as a result of all the ice-covered regions of the Earth melting. We see political disruptions. We've seen the gates of hell open in Syria, but many have not focused on what the scientists are telling us is one of the principal underlying causes. From 2006 to 2010, the worst drought ever measured in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their records only go back 900 years. But that drought, long before the Syrian civil war started, destroyed 60% of their farms, killed 80% of their livestock, drove 1.5 million climate refugees into their cities, where they collided with another 1.5 million refugees from the Iraq War. And WikiLeaks released the internal conversations of the Syrian minister saying, "We can't handle this, it's going to cause a social explosion." And indeed, along with other factors, it did, and the wave of refugees from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa began to grow in numbers across the Mediterranean, and we've seen the European Union become destabilized. We saw in the Brexit vote in the UK, the most powerful advertisement was a huge billboard that they put on vans and traveled around the country with a picture of an endless line of refugees at the borders of Europe. The Defense Department in our country has long warned that crises of refugees, food shortages, water shortages, and pandemic diseases would cause a national security crisis for the world. So the answer to that first question, must we change, is increasingly obvious. Yes, even though we still rely on fossil fuels for more than 80% of the world's energy. What about the second question? Can we change? If the answer to the second question was no, and the answer to the first question was yes, that would be for many people the end of the conversation, because that's a formula for anxiety and stress and despair. Party on. But now, after 10 years of incredible, almost miraculous technology development, investment, hard work by scientists and engineers, and wise choices by some investors, we have seen that solar energy and wind energy and batteries and electric vehicles and many thousands of new efficiency technologies have now become imminently affordable and accessible. Indeed, the latest contracts are selling in some areas. I think of Chile and Abu Dhabi, and the cost continues to come down everywhere in the world. But they're, in these contracts, providing electricity unsubsidized from solar photovoltaic panels at a cost less than half of the cost of electricity from burning fossil fuels. We can change. And I want to put this in a context I only have 5 slides, but I'm not familiar with this clicker, but maybe it'll work. There you go. The sustainability revolution. The alignment of new sources of growth and development with a zero-emission, healthy, equitable, and safe society. Think of this in the context of the other fantastic technologically driven revolutions that we have seen in our world. The agricultural revolution, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, which centralized food production and led to leisure time and the advance of culture in new ways. The industrial revolution, which concentrated the use of power-driven machines and completely changed the world. And more recently, the digital revolution with information and computing technologies that have utterly changed almost every endeavor in life. The sustainability revolution has an interesting mix of characteristics. It has the magnitude and scale of the agricultural and industrial revolution, but it has the speed of the digital revolution. Instead of beginning in a small corner of England in a world of 1.5 billion people and then slowly spreading to Western Europe and the North American colonies, this sustainability revolution is being launched simultaneously in rich and poor countries alike in every single part of the world. We now have the ability, partly thanks to the digital tools that are available, not least the Internet of Things, to manage atoms and molecules and electrons with the same precision that we have come to manage bits of information. And everything is being revolutionized and made more efficient. And there is a business incentive to do so. But we have a problem. And when we look at this topic of economic development, fossil fuels, and the climate crisis, we have to confront the assumption, which has existed since the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania a little over 150 years ago, and the burning of coal and oil began to increase, the assumption that Earth's natural systems have a limitless capacity for self-renewal. This assumption is false because of the impacts of poorly defined growth, impacts that are rapidly increasing. And I want to spend just a moment talking about why the way we define growth is badly flawed. We focus on short-termism, and the metrics that we use are mistaken. They were devised in 1937 by a brilliant economist named Simon Kuznets, who did much of his work in this city. And he was awarded prizes and great honors because of his work, which came to be known as GDP. And in 1937, when he was given all these honors, he made a number of speeches in which he pleaded with the world, please do not use these metrics as a guide for national economic policy. 7 years later, at Bretton Woods, they were codified, as a guide for economic policy. And we've been using them ever since. What Kuznets said as long ago as 1937 is that they have several flaws. Here's what they are. They ignore externalities, both negative and positive. They ignore the depletion of natural resources, and they ignore the distribution of incomes and net worths. Just a word about each of these. Negative externalities is almost a buzz phrase today, and almost everyone knows what that refers to. The most prominent negative externality is pollution. We're using, in the case of the climate crisis, we're using the atmosphere as an open sewer, and we're not measuring the cost of it. Carbon is not priced in most of the world, least of all in the United States of America. Whoops, let me go back. Sorry. I'm not familiar with this particular kind of clicker. Oh, gosh. Just pretend they're not scrolling through these slides while you listen to me do this. Okay, so positive externalities are not as familiar to us, but let me just give you a couple of quick examples. When we invest in mental health care, or community services, or family services, that under the system of metrics that we now use is registered as a cost. In the years and decades that follow, the benefits come rolling back to us, but they are not measured. They are ignored in the way we keep our financial ledgers, in the way we calculate the costs and benefits of the policies that we decide to follow. Inequality. Inequality is like inflation in the following sense. You're likely to always have a little bit of inflation, if God forbid you don't have deflation. But a little bit of inflation can be beneficial. You have to avoid the hyper variety at all costs. A little bit of inequality is a necessary condition for any kind of profit-centered economic system because it unlocks a higher fraction of human potential and has other values. You can argue, but the 20th century was not a useful experiment for the alternatives to capitalism. We need to reform capitalism, in my view. Some will disagree. But while a little inequality is a necessary condition, we have to avoid the hyper variety at all costs. And we are now edging into hyper inequality. And hyper inequality can destroy both capitalism and democracy. But one of the reasons we got into this situation, where we follow economic policies that are designed to boost GDP, and then we're surprised that the little boost in GDP is accompanied by massive amounts of pollution, chronic underinvestment in the services and government functions that benefit human beings, the depletion of natural resources like all the fish in the ocean, and the emergence of hyper inequality that drives this wave of authoritarian populism that we have seen in many parts of the world. We have to have a different measure. Are we blind to the consequences of our economic decisions because we're using the wrong metrics? Yes, we are. Final metaphor. This is a little geeky, so bear with me. We all learned in school about the electromagnetic spectrum, from the very short radio waves, very short gamma rays to the very long radio waves, X-rays, microwaves, everything in between. What we focus on is the spectrum we call visible light. And since everybody else focuses on that in the main, we kind of assume that's all there is that matters. It is only 0.1% of the spectrum. For the 8 years I worked in the White House, I started every morning with at least an hour-long briefing from the intelligence community, which, as you may have read, collects from the entire spectrum. And the picture presented was much more complete because of the meaning and information gathered from infrared and ultraviolet and all of the radio and television and telephone parts of the spectrum. In our economic decision making, when we sit down to devise policies for economic development, when we evaluate the wisdom of continuing to burn fossil fuels at this absurd rate, we are looking at a very tiny slice of the spectrum of value, and we are ignoring the rest of that spectrum. Investors as well look at the numbers coming over their Bloomberg screens and the numbers in the quarterly reports. What about a company's environmental practices? What about their human relations practices? How do they treat the communities in which they're located? What are the ethics in the executive suite? Savvy investors know that those values in the rest of the spectrum can be even more important for predicting the future performance of those companies, just as those who have good public policies and governments know that you cannot look just at GDP as it is presently narrowly and incorrectly defined. So let me close by, so the answer to the second question, can we change, is yes. We have renewable energy. We have the sustainability revolution. It is moving forward at warp speed. It is extremely encouraging. And as Bert said earlier, we are now seeing governors and mayors and business leaders and civil society leaders saying that we will continue to meet the commitments made under Paris. Big companies like Apple and Google are moving to 100% renewable energy. California and New York are moving faster than the commitments made by former President Obama in Paris. There is a long list on the internet now of all of the states and cities and companies and organizations that are saying we're still in Paris. And indeed, if there's a punchline from what I'm telling you, the United States of America is going to continue as if we are legally in Paris, as we will be legally in Paris under the measures taken by President Trump, because it was designed according to terms that legally, no matter what he does, we cannot withdraw until November 4th, 2020. That's one day after the election of November 3rd, 2020. No one person can stop the climate movement. And that's what I want to end with as an answer to the third and final question. Will we change? And just as I tried to put the sustainability revolution in the context of the previous technologically driven revolutions in human history, I want to put the climate movement in the context of the previous moral movements in human history, because they all have some things in common. When the abolition movement began in England almost 200 years ago, it was met with ferocious resistance. Opponent after opponent said, no, we will not go along with it. When the movement for women's suffrage and women's rights went to the streets of this city and streets around the world, there was ferocious resistance. And those who resisted said, no, we'll never go along with this. When the civil rights movement began to move into a new phase in my native South, I remember it as a boy. The resistance was even fiercer than the resistance to the climate movement. When the anti-apartheid movement began in South Africa, it was fiercely resisted. The late Nelson Mandela said, it is always impossible until it's done. More recently, the gay rights movement in this country. If someone had said to me even 7 years ago, in the year 2017, gay marriage will be fully legal in all 50 states and will be accepted, honored, and celebrated by more than 2/3 of the American people, I would have said, well, I sure hope so, but what are you smoking? But it was done. What all of these movements had in common is not only the resistance and the fierce expression of no, all of them were ultimately resolved into a simple binary choice. What is right? and what is wrong. The climate movement is on the cusp of being resolved into precisely that choice. It is wrong to pollute this earth and to bequeath to the coming generations a degraded hell on this planet. It is right to move forward with the sustainability revolution and create tens of millions of new jobs, transforming the economy and our civilization into a sustainable, clean, just pattern. We can do it. It is now at the inflection point where people are awakening to exactly what we must do. For those who doubt that we have the political will to accomplish this, I will say, as I often do, please remember that the will to change is itself a renewable resource. Thank you.
Thank you to Vice President Gore. Thank you to Patricia Williams, Aza Karam, and Bert Visotsky, and of course to Corinna Gore for this panel. We're going to very briefly ask a couple of questions that hopefully will generate some response, and then certainly we look forward to hearing from you in the audience with regard to any questions that will further this conversation. Let me just ever so quickly say that Aza and Vice President Gore, both of you, and in larger measure everyone on the panel, has spoken about the moral imperative, whether it be engaged in the context of faith or just the force of the moral argument. And I guess the question would be that in the context of Union Seminary being an institution where morals and ethics are certainly a driving factor, what are some of the ways that we can practically engage in such a forceful and compelling argument? What are the things that we should be thinking about to further that moral argument for the imperative of climate change? Whosoever will.
Oh, I'll speak as a rabbi here. One of the things I wanted to raise up in my brief talk was that it is appropriate, as Vice President Gore taught us, to use the language of right and wrong and the language of sin. To pollute the earth is a sin. To sustain the earth is God's command to us. And I think that language needs to be preached from pulpits across the land so that everyone in every pew in every parish will be out there doing their work.
If I may follow up on that, I can give the practical and concrete examples from the work of the United Nations in reaching out to and the United Nations system, which includes our colleagues in the World Bank, of actually reaching out to mobilize various religious voices from different communities, religious leaders, faith-based organizations, which deliver 60% of basic social services around the world. So they reach people, they actually deliver services, food, nutrition, education. That's a remarkable capacity of outreach that is unparalleled by any government anywhere in the world, quite frankly. And the point here is that the outreach to those communities becomes a systemic and sustained and deliberate outreach. One of the key partnership strategies to bring these communities to the table so that they can speak the voice of truth and stand witness to some of the data, actually using the evidence that is out there. That is what convinces many of the most recalcitrant folks out there, especially from the faith communities, because the moral voice becomes contingent upon truth, and the truth can sometimes speak through the facts, the figures, and the narratives of that which is happening around us. And those who refuse to believe that truth often are not the voice that is moral.
I'll just say briefly that I'm struck that in the news media, climate is often ignored. I mentioned these climate-related extreme weather events, and as I told our group earlier today, every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. But those who deliver the news almost never connect the dots. One of our participants in the dialogue today mentioned that for calendar year 2016, if you added up the news coverage on all of the networks for the entire year of the climate crisis, it added up to a grand total of 90 minutes for a full year. We went through the third presidential election cycle in a row without a single question about the climate crisis being asked by any of the moderators in the fall general election debates. During the primary debates, there were a couple. Chris Wallace of Fox asked one. It was very, very well put, but none elsewhere. Now, the reason I bring this up is another of our participants today noted that the same, present company accepted, because the members of the clergy who are here in all the various faith traditions are the exceptions, truly. But the same absence of discussion of climate that we see in the news media, generally speaking, is true in churches and synagogues, most synagogues and mosques, and other households of worship. And the truth is still, in a way, inconvenient. And sometimes people are afraid to bring it up. It reminds me of a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic father, where the other members of the family are afraid to mention the word alcohol, lest the father of the household fly into a rage. And so people are careful to tiptoe around forbidden subjects. Climate has caused some people to fly into a rage. And some clergy know that their congregations include such people. The news media outlets know that their audiences include some who will instantly change the channel, and their ratings go down. And so the first thing we can do is win the conversation and insist that the conversations take place. You don't have to be mean or overly assertive, but be persistent and win the conversation. The civil rights movement succeeded in part because the conversation about civil rights was won by men and women of good conscience and courage who insisted on winning that conversation. By the way, I hope that the congregations represented here and those who are watching on the live stream will also go to the movie, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, which comes out July 28th. 100% of the proceeds go to the Climate Reality Project to further the work of helping to solve the climate crisis, but consider taking congregations to it. It can start and win conversations.
Thank you. Corinna?
I don't have any.
I have a question. So it's interesting, sometimes we talk about the way that a value system in this world is as secular, as neutral to religious ideas. And yet we know from history that it is in fact deeply rooted in some religious ideas, and particularly perhaps a distortion of Judeo-Christian ideas by the forces of empire and colonization. And I say that I wanted to point out something that has happened recently, which is that there have been some cases where there has been legal personhood for rivers in countries in India and New Zealand in particular. And when we hear that, maybe that sounds unusual, like a radical idea, and then actually, in fact, the fact that we don't have that here, and instead we have legal personhood for corporations, is not a neutral thing. It is based on a culture that has elevated humanity as the only important agent in the world. It reminds me a little bit, you drew analogies with different movements, and one of the ones was gay marriage. I remember reading about the decision in the New York Times whether to put gay weddings on the wedding page, and the argument against doing so is they said, well, we don't want to be making a political statement on this page. And at some point they realized, we're making a political statement by not putting the gay weddings on this page. So my question, and I want to direct this particularly to Pat, is about the assumptions that we have in our legal constructs. For instance, even the fact that somebody, a private corporation, can own things beneath the ground, not only fossil fuels, but huge amounts of groundwater, which increasingly we're seeing being bought up. Are we anywhere near a place where we can question that on a level that maybe we made a mistake building a legal construct that's permissible for private ownership? And could you speak to whether that's possible to question?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that the existence of corporations, we sort of forget, it's a legal construct, but it's also, if one were to translate it, it's also a kind of religious, faith-based construct. And so when you actually go back in time to William Blackstone's description of the history of the corporation, it was because, individual business people or, guild members who had their little, they were conducting the baker or the wheel maker. When he died, his business disappeared. And so the corporation was invented as literally making the business immortal so that transactions could continue. So in some weird way, it's a legal construct of immortality in some way. And so it's no less magical in some sense than the idea of a river as a kind of sustenance for a kind of immortality in a biological sense or in a biome sense than the corporation is in the business world. But we have, to some degree, privileged that kind of respect or regard or even legal personhood for a corporation at the expense of, for example, the personhood of a dolphin or an elephant or the beings that coexist with us. And again, it's like drawing a boundary around our sense of the faith in continuity and the faith of, if not immortality, then connectivity, that kind of regard of legal personhood that it confers. But it is a kind of religious, in the true sense of, or the etymological sense of religion as religare, of tying us together within a system. And so I think that's important to remember, that we could as easily, take this out of the realm of the magical into a conferring of regard. It's a way of seeing, it's a way of undoing the blindness that Vice President Gore was referring to. It is taking it out of the realm of externality to which we don't pay attention and bringing into the realm of our concern in remediation, whether political or legal or worshipful, making it present in our lives.
Could I comment briefly? I spend a good bit of time in the business world now, and there is a movement toward the formation of what are called B corporations, which take a different legal form. There is also a very powerful movement toward the integration of sustainability into the management of corporations and into the strategies of investors. And there is a considerable literature now from business schools and research institutions showing that those businesses that fully incorporate sustainability are actually performing better than others. Out of 23 market sectors, in 17 of them, the highest performers are the ones that incorporate sustainability.
Wonderful. Well, we have time for a few questions, and we have several roving microphones. So I'm going to ask that those people with their microphones make their way to hands that are raised, and we'd ask that your questions be succinct and direct so we can get as many in the short amount of time that we have available to do so. And I see.
Hi. What do you think of Michael Bloomberg's plan to appeal to the United Nations that maybe part of this country could be part of the Paris Accord?
Azam, you want to take that?
Not really, but I will try. I'm not quite sure what the legalities around it is, and I am not qualified to speak to the legalities. I doubt very much that we can do that parceling of the sovereignty of the nation state per specific thematic issues or areas. That hasn't proved very effective in the past. And the conversations about and the discussions that went on within the UN about the responsibility to protect, even just where nations are and members of certain communities have undergone or are undergoing tremendous suffering as a result of certain state institutions, has proved to us that the context of sovereignty becomes the overruling objective within the United Nations mechanisms, and therefore to parcel out any particular sub-national entity or theme and give it an added value proves to be a very hard ask to realize. What is much more plausible is the context of a Sustainable Development Goals agenda to which various entities within a sovereign state can commit themselves because there are clear indicators and indices for measuring the extent to which the nation as a whole, as a component of its parts, can do to deliver on those certain indicators. But that is about the best we can do within that particular UN framework, I'm afraid.
If I could comment, regardless of the difficulties, I hope that he succeeds, and I want to compliment Mike Bloomberg for what he's doing to rally mayors in cities around this country and in many parts of the world. There is now on the internet a site you can Google "We Are Still In," and the list of U.S. cities that are committing themselves to remain committed to the goals undertaken by the U.S. in the Paris Agreement is really quite impressive. Governor Jerry Brown of California is in China today. Tomorrow he will be meeting with provinces in China, and even though it's unusual and difficult, he has signed agreements formally between California and other subnational entities around the world, and he is going to sign up some provinces in China tomorrow to join this. There are 120, well, Mexico and Canada have joined, and 120 state, provincial governments have also joined. So Mike Bloomberg, Jerry Brown, I mentioned Andrew Cuomo here in New York, and many others are now taking the subnational entities and saying we're going to be a party to this whether President Trump is or not. And I think that is a very useful and powerful initiative.
So just a quick clarification to say that's absolutely possible within the framework of the United Nations. Right. So that would not be the... Yeah.
It may not work.
And can I also say that I think that Michael Bloomberg is appealing to a corporate cluster and network that is not just subnational but national, but also almost supranational. When he has Amazon and Google also working on behalf of this particular goal, it's transnational. Yeah.
The question I'd like to ask is from a religious or business perspective. Could any one of you on the panel speak to the issue of property ownership in relation to climate change?
Let me talk about a concept that's found in the Torah. And it's a very powerful concept for me as an academic because it's the sabbatical. And I value my own sabbatical every 7 years. But the fact is that it's literally grounded in the notion that every 7 years we give the land a rest. We don't plant it, we don't work it, we, as it were, return it to God. When we stack up 7 sabbaticals, we have a Jubilee year. And in that Jubilee year, land reverts to its original owner. It's another one of these claims that no human being owns the land. It belongs to God, and therefore it can always revert, and we always have the possibility of giving it the rest it needs to replenish, and reminding people we don't own not only the what's under the earth, as Corinna said, or the groundwater, we don't own any of it. It's really not ours to dispose of.
And I was just going to say, at least in Anglo-American jurisprudence, which has certainly influenced much of the global relationship of what we describe as property, property is described as the right to exclude. So it's, if it's mine, and all of the rest of you don't worry about it, and I can put any value and I can do with it as I like, and nobody else is supposed to worry upstream or downstream, it's mine. There's an alternative, which one sees particularly in agricultural life, which and again, coming from France, I'm really particularly intrigued by the fact that despite the civil law codes, which are basically the right to exclude, agricultural, part of the reason rural France is so pretty is that the land has a right to be farmed. So the regulations make it very difficult simply to stick a skyscraper in the middle of the countryside. And it isn't just that they are regulating human beings from not doing that, it is almost a free industrial notion of the land having a right to be the land. And that's, and I think, one can express that a number of different ways, but it's not just the right of dominion, human-centered dominion, to exclude other influences. It's a non-human-centered ontology, again, very much like what is expressed in the Pope's encyclical, which is why I find that such an engaging document, that the land itself is given a kind of voice, or if not voice, in the magical sense, as sometimes people want to dismiss it, then a sense of regard for how it exists.
Thank you very much for all your wonderful comments. I've learned quite a bit this evening. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some underlying assumptions, perhaps if you would be willing, that you think the world is currently operating under that are dangerous, and how you might challenge that underlying assumption. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned a couple. One is the assumption that the Earth is so powerfully self-healing that it can absorb whatever insults we heap upon it. And science is telling us that's simply false. So that is one assumption that I think is in need of challenge. I mentioned another set of assumptions on the way we measure economic value that should be challenged. I won't repeat them now, but I'd offer that as an answer to your question.
If I may, I think there is one assumption that there's a little bit like the elephant in the room, but those of us who work with sovereign states come across them very often, which is that might is right. And I think that assumption, unfortunately, is undergirds a great deal of the negotiations around how we can claim selfhood and dignity. And if there is no power in the physical sense, in the military sense, in the economic sense behind that claim, it can be a very difficult claim to make and to uphold. Not to say that it doesn't happen. Of course it happens, and that's the point of the whole resistance and why it has been a discourse of resistance consecutively over centuries. But that context and assumption that might is right is unfortunately coming back pretty strongly.
We have time for two brief quotes, if we can get somebody back a little further back that way.
Hello, thank you very much for the panel today. My question is about trauma and its relationship to our response to climate change. And I think many of us, for many generations, have felt the trauma of the separation from land and the hurting of land. And the example you gave of the Syrian droughts that displaced almost 70% of the rural population, and what you have experienced in terms of, I tend to find when people are traumatized, either they take the long and arduous journey to heal, or they traumatize themselves and re-traumatize other people. And so I'd love to hear something about how we individually can address some of the trauma that we're feeling from what's happening to our planet, and how we can alchemize that so that we become healers.
Actually, I'd love to hear Serene answer that question. That's
what I
really
was-
her
exactly what I was
expertise. She's written an incredible book on trauma, and
Well, two things come to mind, and thanks, Bobby, for that wonderful question. First of all, I think that part of what the panel has been pointing to and the shifts in the conversation have been pointing to is that we need to think of trauma as not just something that happens to individuals and communities, but it happens to the earth itself. And that's the sort of, as we begin to extend our framework for thinking about what violence doesn't just fracture the psyche of an individual person, a collective community. We need to be able to think about what it does to what one might understand as the psyche of the coherence of the earth itself. And then what we know about how people heal from trauma is it's a very long and hard process, and it's not one that you ever get over violence that's done to you if you're a person or a community or the earth, but there is the capacity to move on, and that requires people telling the truth about the harm that has happened, having people willing to hear the truth about the harm that has happened, and the capacity to, in that testifying and being witnessed, to create a new story about what the effects of what happened are by changing actions and having, in fact, a kind of new ending. And I think it's exactly what Vice President Gore talks about in terms of the, we've got the must, we've got the can, and it's the question of traumatic healing is really the question of will we? And it's the question of will we take the next step in terms of writing a new ending to this story that we think that we've already finished. So, how embarrassing
Thank you.
to have to jump onto the panel like that. So,
Thank you. We want to thank our panelists, President Serene Jones, Azza Karam, Rabbi Bert Visotsky, Professor Patricia Williams, and Vice President Al Gore for your time, your insights, and your continuing work. Please, once again, give our panelists a round of applause. And we also want to thank the brilliant team from the Center for Earth Ethics who planned tonight's event as part of their 3-day ministers training program held here at Union Theological Seminary. Corinna Gore, Shannon Smith, Peggy Cusack, as well as a number of current Union students and alums. We are thankful to all of you for your long and hard and arduous work. Now listen, for those of you who are eager to continue this discussion, please visit our website, utsnyc.edu, to learn more about Union's upcoming programs and events, including Paradigm Shifts 2017, which is a 3-day music and film festival to be held here at Union, celebrating the people preserving our planet and all of the work that they do from around the globe. Again, that's Paradigm Shift, June 13th through 17th. You can go to our website to hear more about it, and we invite you to be a part of that. We invite you to all attend a reception tonight in our refectory, which is directly across the way from here in the chapel as you make your exit. And again, as a final word for those of you who are participating in the ministers' training, please convene downstairs in the social hall at 8:30 sharp. Thank you to all of those who were with us on live stream, to all of you who are with us tonight. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.